October 17th, 1973. The sun beat down on the parched earth of the Sinai Peninsula, a relentless glare that had become a familiar, unwelcome companion. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything. The worn uniforms, the sand-choked mechanisms of their tank, and the gritty taste in their mouths. Inside the cramped confines of their M60 Patton, the air was thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and fear. Sergeant Ben Carter, a man whose face was etched with a premature weariness beyond his 30 years, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. He glanced at his crew, each man a silent testament to the brutal reality of their situation. Corporal Dave Miller, the gunner, a nervous twitch in his left eye, meticulously checked and rechecked the main gun's breech. Dave was barely out of high school when he enlisted, his idealism quickly eroding under the harsh sun and constant threat. He clutched a dog-eared photograph of his sweetheart, a blonde girl with a shy smile whenever he thought no one was looking. Specialist Mark "Mac" McMillan, the loader, a stocky man with forearms like tree trunks, sat hunched, his gaze fixed on the ammunition rack. Mac had a wife and 2 young kids back in Ohio, and the thought of them was a constant, gnawing ache in his gut. And finally, Private First Class Tony Sparks Rodriguez, the driver, a quiet, intense young man who communicated mostly through gestures and the subtle movements of his hands on the controls. Sparks had a natural affinity for machines, a talent that had saved them more than once. They were part of a larger company, but in the chaos of the past few days, communication had become a luxury. Reports were fragmented, often contradictory, and always grim. The enemy offensive had been swift, brutal, and unexpected. They had been pushed back, then pushed back again, until now they found themselves isolated, deep behind what was once their own lines. "Status report, gentlemen." Ben's voice was calm, almost unnervingly so, a stark contrast to the frantic pounding of his own heart. "Gun's good, Sarge," Dave mumbled, not looking up. 70 rounds left, main gun. "Cokes is almost dry," Mac grunted. 30 rounds for the cokes. Not much. "Fuel's low, Sarge," Sparks reported, his voice a low hum over the engine's idle. "Maybe another hour if we don't push it." Ben nodded slowly, the grim arithmetic playing out in his mind. 70 rounds, 30 rounds, 1 hour of fuel, and no immediate prospect of resupply or reinforcement. They were a metal coffin on wheels, waiting for the inevitable. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant rumble of artillery and the ever-present drone of flies. "Any word on Lieutenant Adams?" Dave finally broke the silence, his voice cracking slightly. Ben shook his head. "Last I heard, their company was overrun yesterday morning. No survivors reported." He didn't need to add the implication. They were truly on their own. A collective sigh escaped the crew. Lieutenant Adams had been a good man, respected by his troops. His loss, along with so many others, weighed heavily. The idealism of war, if it had ever existed for these men, had long since evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal instinct for survival and a grim acceptance of their fate. Ben remembered the excited chatter on the transport ship, the bravado and nervous jokes. Young men, full of an almost naive patriotism, eager to serve their country. He recalled his own youthful eagerness when he first enlisted, the sense of purpose and adventure. Now, looking at the tired, haunted faces of his crew, he saw only the toll that war took, the way it stripped away everything but the bare essentials of existence. He pulled out a crumpled map, its edges soft from repeated folding. It was a crude sketch, marked with hastily scrawled enemy positions and their own rapidly shrinking perimeter. Their current location was a desolate stretch of desert, a slight rise offering a limited field of view. To their west, a low ridge. To their east, miles of open, unforgiving sand. To their south, a faint shimmering on the horizon suggested enemy movement. "All right," Ben said, his voice regaining its command. "Here's the situation. We're isolated. We're low on ammo, low on fuel, and we're surrounded. We have 2 options. We surrender, or we make a stand." He didn't need to elaborate on the implications of surrender. Stories of captured soldiers, of the brutal treatment they received, were whispered like ghost stories in the ranks. None of them entertained the idea. They were American soldiers, and they would fight. "So we stand," Mac said, his voice firm, a hint of defiance in his tone. Dave nodded, his hand instinctively gripping the firing mechanism. "Yeah, we stand." Sparks just offered a tight-lipped nod, his eyes focused forward, already anticipating the movements he would have to make. Ben felt a surge of pride, a quiet admiration for these men who, despite the overwhelming odds, refused to break. They were scared, undoubtedly, but their resolve was unwavering. "Good. Then let's make it count." He spent the next few minutes outlining their defensive strategy. Their M60, while formidable, was a single point of resistance against an unseen number of enemy tanks and infantry. They would use the slight elevation to their advantage, maximizing their fields of fire. Sparks would keep the engine running, ready to move at a moment's notice, to reposition and avoid being flanked. Dave would prioritize targets, focusing on the most immediate threats. Mac would work tirelessly, feeding the hungry gun, his movements a blur of practiced efficiency. As they prepared, each man lost in his own thoughts, the silence was broken by a new sound. A low, growing rumble that vibrated through the hull of the tank, a sound that sent a chill down their spines. It was the unmistakable roar of multiple engines, growing louder by the second. "Contact!" Dave yelled, his voice strained. "Multiple targets, bearing 240, tanks!" Ben peered through his periscope, the desert landscape suddenly alive with motion. A line of enemy T-62 tanks, their low silhouettes unmistakable, advanced across the shimmering sand, their guns already traversing. Behind them, a swarm of infantry, moving like ants. "Mac, armor-piercing," Ben barked. "Dave, target leading tank. Fire when ready." Mac's hands flew, pulling a heavy APFSDS round from its rack and ramming it into the breech with a practiced clang. The smell of propellant filled the air. Dave, his nervousness replaced by a laser-like focus, aligned his sights. "Target acquired," he reported, his finger hovering over the firing button. "Fire," Ben commanded. The M60 bucked violently as the main gun roared, a blinding flash erupting from the muzzle. The round streaked across the desert, a metal dart propelled by unimaginable force. A millisecond later, a secondary explosion blossomed on the lead T-62, a geyser of flame and smoke erupting from its turret. The enemy tank lurched, then screeched to a halt, its forward momentum suddenly arrested. "Direct hit," Dave shouted, a momentary flicker of triumph in his eyes. "Good shot, Dave. Sparks, reposition us slightly, 20 degrees right. Keep us moving, even if it's just a little," Ben ordered, already scanning for the next target. The enemy tanks, momentarily stunned by the sudden loss of their lead vehicle, recovered quickly. Their own guns began to bark, sending shells shrieking overhead, impacting the sand around them with violent concussions that rattled the M60. The world outside became a maelstrom of dust, fire, and explosions. "Incoming! Brace for impact!" Mac yelled, instinctively ducking his head. A shell slammed into the M60's side armor with a deafening thud, sending a shower of sparks and shrapnel ricocheting inside. The tank shuddered violently, and the lights flickered. "Damage report," Ben shouted over the ringing in his ears. "Minor damage to the track guard, Sarge. Nothing critical," Sparks reported, his voice tight but steady. He expertly maneuvered the tank, a short, sharp burst of acceleration, then a quick turn, making them a harder target. "Keep it up, Sparks," Ben encouraged. "Dave, next tank. Fire at will." The M60 roared again, another APFSDS round flying true. This time, the enemy tank's engine compartment was hit, and black smoke began to pour from its rear. But the enemy was adapting. Their tanks spread out, attempting to flank them, while their infantry began to advance, laying down a suppressing fire with automatic rifles and machine guns. Bullets pinged off the M60's armor, a metallic chorus of death. "Infantry to the left flank, Sarge. They're getting close," Mac yelled, his voice strained as he loaded another round. "Sparks, traverse left. Bring the cokes to bear. Dave, focus on the tanks. Mac, get ready with a high-explosive round if they get too close." Ben's commands were rapid fire, each one a desperate gamble. The coaxial machine gun chattered, spitting a stream of tracers that ripped into the advancing infantry. Screams mingled with the roar of engines and explosions. The battlefield was a hellish symphony. Another enemy shell struck them, this time glancing off the turret, sending a jolt through the tank and causing the lights to flicker again. The internal monitors momentarily went dark, then flickered back to life. "They're hitting us hard, Sarge," Dave gasped, sweat pouring down his face. His hands were trembling, but his aim remained steady. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, gentlemen," Ben said, his voice strained but firm. He knew this was it. They weren't going to get out of this. Not alive, anyway. But they would go down fighting. They would make the enemy pay for every inch of ground, for every casualty they inflicted. He thought of his own family, his parents back in Nebraska, his younger sister who was just starting college. He pictured their faces, tried to hold on to those images, to find some peace in them. But the reality of the present, the roar of the guns, the acrid smell of burning fuel, dragged him back. He looked at his crew. Dave, his face a mask of grim determination, still firing with precision. Mac, a sweat-soaked titan, loading round after round with relentless energy. Sparks, a master of his machine, weaving and turning, buying them precious seconds. They were heroes, every last one of them, even if no one would ever know their names. "Ammo check," Ben barked, trying to drown out the voice in his head that whispered of futility. 20 rounds left, main gun," Dave reported, his voice hoarse. "Cokes is almost empty." "High explosive rounds?" Ben asked Mac. "2 left, Sarge." They were running on fumes, both literally and figuratively. The enemy pressed their advantage, their numbers overwhelming. More T-62s emerged from the dust, seemingly endless. The M60, battered and bruised, was a lone island against a rising tide. An enemy shell hit them square on the front glacis, sending a shockwave through the tank. The M60 groaned, its internal systems screaming in protest. A sudden, acrid smell of burning electronics filled the air. Sparks let out a cry of pain. "Sparks, you all right?" Ben yelled, fear gripping him. "Right arm, hit," Sparks choked out, but he still gripped the controls, his left hand compensating. "Still moving, Sarge." "Damn it." Ben cursed under his breath. He knew Sparks wouldn't last much longer. The enemy fire was relentless now, a hail of steel and fire. "Sarge, multiple infantry closing from the right, too close for the main gun," Mac yelled, pointing frantically. "High explosive round, Mac. Dave, target that cluster of infantry." "Sparks, hold steady for a moment," Ben ordered. Mac slammed a high explosive round into the breach. Dave swung the turret, the cokes chattering uselessly, empty. He focused the main gun on the advancing infantry, a desperate gamble. Fire! The HE round exploded amongst the enemy troops with a horrific tearing sound, sending bodies flying. A momentary lull in the infantry assault, but it wouldn't last. Suddenly, the tank lurched violently. The engine sputtered, then died. Silence descended, a terrifying, absolute silence inside the tank, broken only by the distant roar of enemy engines and the crackle of burning debris. "Sparks? What happened?" Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Engine's dead, Sarge," Sparks said, his voice weak. "Took a hit to the fuel line and the engine block." They were a sitting duck, immobile, defenseless. The air grew thick with the smell of gasoline and burning metal. Smoke began to curl from the engine compartment. 15 rounds left, Sarge," Dave reported, his voice hollow. "Main gun." Ben looked around the interior of the tank, the battered controls, the flickering lights, the exhausted faces of his crew. He saw the grim acceptance in their eyes, the understanding that their time had come. He pulled out his personal sidearm, a Colt 45, checking its magazine. He knew it was a symbolic gesture, a last act of defiance. "All right, gentlemen," Ben said, his voice surprisingly steady. "This is it. We've done our duty. We fought with honor." He paused, taking a deep breath. "And we'll fight to the last man." There was no protest, no argument, only nods of grim resolve. They were a family forged in fire, facing their final moments together. The enemy tanks were closer now, their turrets traversing, their guns pointing directly at them. The infantry, emboldened by the M60's silence, began to swarm them, their figures growing larger in the periscopes. Ben watched them approach, a strange sense of calm settling over him. He thought of his parents again, and a quiet prayer formed on his lips. He wished he could tell them he loved them, that he was proud of what he had done. "Dave," Ben said, his voice clear, "one last shot. Make it count. Dave nodded, his eyes narrowed, focusing on the lead enemy tank, now directly in front of them. He aimed with practiced ease, knowing this was his final act. Mac, though his arms were heavy with fatigue, loaded the last APFSDS round with a final desperate burst of energy. "Fire," Ben commanded, his voice a roar of defiance. The M60 bucked one last time, a final defiant gasp of thunder. The round tore through the air, a final testament to their will to resist. The lead enemy tank erupted in a fiery explosion, a final victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. But even as the enemy tank burned, the remaining T-62s returned fire. Shells slammed into the M60 from all sides, a barrage of steel and fire. The interior of the tank became a maelstrom of explosions, shrapnel, and screams. The world dissolved into a blinding flash of white, then darkness. The silence that followed was absolute, a stark contrast to the cacophony that had preceded it. The desert winds whispered across the shattered hulk of the M60 Patton, a tomb of twisted metal and silent heroes. The dust settled, covering everything, erasing the last vestiges of their struggle. No one would ever know the names of the men inside, the courage they displayed, the last stand they made. They were just another statistic, another casualty of a forgotten war. But in that moment, facing insurmountable odds, they knew. They knew they would not survive. And yet they fought. And in doing so, they etched their bravery into the unforgiving sands of history, a silent testament to the unwavering spirit of the American soldier.